She's not on the bus. Caleb said it again louder this time, his voice cracking under the weight of what he already knew. Mr. Sterling, she is not on the bus. The teacher turned around slowly the way men do when they've already decided not to care. Outside, the mountain was swallowing everything. The wind hit the windows like something angry and alive. And somewhere out there in that white screaming, nothing, a girl was already dying. Everyone else was counting luggage. Caleb Daniels was counting minutes. If this story hits you somewhere deep, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning the school booked the ski trip to Cascade Ridge, Caleb Daniels had exactly one clean pair of jeans to his name, a backpack with a broken zipper held shut by a bent paper clip, and a scholarship letter from Hargrove Academy folded so many times the creases had gone white. He had read it maybe 200 times in the past 8 months, not because he needed to remember what it said, because he needed to remember why he was doing this. His mother had cried when it came in the mail, not the soft, quiet kind of crying she did when the bank called about the second mortgage. The loud kind. The kind that came from somewhere she didn't visit often. His grandfather had stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her, and when she finally got hold of herself, the old man had put his hand on Caleb's shoulder and said, "You're going somewhere none of us ever got to go. Don't you waste a single second of it." Hargrove Academy was 37 miles from the Daniels farm. It might as well have been a different planet. The school sat at the edge of Millbrook, a private institution with a campus that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine and set down gently in the middle of New Hampshire. The buildings were old and deliberate. The students drove cars that cost more than Caleb's family made in a year. They spoke a certain way, not louder than other people, just more assured, like the world had already confirmed that their words mattered. Caleb had learned very quickly in his first semester that the scholarship program was the school's way of feeling good about itself. There were 6 scholarship students in his year. They ate lunch together by default, not by choice. They shared the same unspoken understanding. They were guests in a house that didn't belong to them. And the trick was not to touch anything. He kept his head down. He got his grades. He did not go to parties he wasn't invited to, did not try to insert himself into conversations that went silent when he walked past, did not pretend the whispers weren't happening. He focused on the 2 things that made sense to him: his schoolwork and what his grandfather had taught him about the land, about animals, about surviving things that didn't care whether you lived or died. The ski trip was announced in October for February. It was optional, which at Hargrove meant it was mandatory if you wanted to exist socially. The cost was $400. Caleb's scholarship covered it as an enrichment activity. He knew this because he had read the scholarship documentation 3 times before submitting the form. He did not want to go. He went because his grandfather told him to. "You don't have to love it," the old man said, sitting on the porch the night before the cold, already settling in hard the way it did on the farm in January. "You just have to show up. Showing up is the whole thing, boy. Most people quit before they even get there." The bus left at 6 in the morning on a Friday. 42 students, 2 teachers, 1 driver. Caleb was the second person on the bus. He took a window seat in the middle, put his backpack on the floor between his feet, and looked straight ahead. By the time the last students boarded 20 minutes late, every other seat around him was taken by necessity. No one sat next to him by choice. A boy named Prescott dropped into the seat across the aisle, glanced at Caleb's jacket, last year's, a little short in the sleeve, and turned away without a word. Caleb put in one earbud and watched the campus disappear behind them. The mountains showed up 2 hours into the drive, the way they always did on this route, sudden and enormous, rising out of the tree line like something the earth had pushed up in a moment of anger. Caleb had seen mountains before. He'd worked in cold that would kill most of these kids inside an hour. But there was something different about the weight of these ridges, the way the sky had gone, the color of a bruise behind them, even at 9 in the morning. He noticed the weather first. Not dramatically, not with alarm, just a quiet noticing, the same way his grandfather had taught him to read a field, not by looking at it all at once, but by paying attention to the pieces. The wind pattern had shifted. The temperature was dropping faster than the forecast had called for. The clouds to the northwest were moving wrong. Too heavy, too fast. He thought about saying something. Then he thought about who he would say it to. "Mr. Sterling, The senior history teacher chaperoning the trip was sitting at the front of the bus, reading something on his tablet with his legs crossed and his coffee balanced on the armrest. He was 47, Yale-educated, the kind of man who corrected pronunciation in casual conversation. He had called Caleb Craig for the first 6 weeks of class and shown no particular distress when corrected. Caleb decided not to say anything. That was the first decision, the one that would haunt him for the next 6 hours until a worse one replaced it. The ski lodge was called Pinnacle Ridge, and it sat at the base of a mountain whose upper half had already disappeared into cloud by the time they arrived. The resort staff looked nervous. Caleb noticed that too, the way one of the lift operators kept checking his radio, the way the woman at the front desk smiled too hard when she said the conditions were a little unpredictable and that the resort was monitoring the situation. Monitoring. That was a word people used when they had already made a decision and didn't want to say it out loud. The students poured off the bus in a wave of expensive gear and loud confidence. Caleb stepped off last, adjusted his borrowed ski jacket, a hand-me-down from the school's athletic donation bin, and looked up at the mountain. The wind was picking up. He could feel it in the way the cold came at him, in pulses instead of steady pressure. He pulled his backpack tighter and walked inside. He was standing at the equipment rental counter, quietly giving his boot size to a teenager who was barely paying attention when he first saw Ravenwolf. She came in through a side door alone, a long black ski jacket, dark hair loose around her shoulders, moving with the kind of careful, contained energy that Caleb recognized from certain animals, the ones that had learned the world was more dangerous than it looked. She didn't scan the room the way the other students did, looking for their people, locating their friends. She scanned it the way someone did when they were checking for exits. He'd seen her at school. Everyone had, but seeing and knowing were different things at Hargrove. What Caleb knew about Ravenwolf was what everyone knew her last name. Her father was Marcus Griswolf, president of the Hells Angels chapter out of Manchester, New Hampshire. She'd come to Hargrove 2 years ago under circumstances no one discussed openly, though they discussed them endlessly in whispers. The running theory was that Grizz had money, real money, the kind that didn't need a paper trail, and that Hargrove had quietly accepted it in the way private schools accepted certain donations without asking where they came from. The other theory, the one Caleb thought was probably closer to true, was that Griswolf was trying to give his daughter something he couldn't give her in the world he'd built. Whatever the reason, Raven didn't fit. Not at Hargrove, where everyone had a script and a social lane. She sat alone in the back of classrooms. She didn't eat in the dining hall. She didn't respond to the whispers or the not-quite cruelty that passed for social hierarchy at a school like Hargrove. She moved through it all with a distance that people read as arrogance because it was easier than reading it as pain. Caleb recognized it because he lived a smaller version of it every day. He didn't say hello. She wasn't looking at him anyway. By 10:30, the mountain had made its position clear. The lifts had been running, but 2 of the upper runs were already closed. The snow had started an hour ago, not the soft, photogenic kind that showed up in resort brochures, but the serious kind, coming sideways, mean and purposeful. Mr. Sterling had gathered the group in the lodge for what he called a brief orientation, and what was actually him reading instructions from a laminated card while the students paid attention to their phones. Buddy system at all times, Sterling said. No one goes above the blue runs without an instructor present. And please, for the love of everything, keep your rentals on until I say otherwise. Caleb was listening. He always listened, even when it didn't matter. It was a habit from the farm. His grandfather had told him that attention was a survival skill, and that most disasters happened to people who were paying attention to something else. He was watching the window when the first real gust hit the building hard enough to make the glass flex. Nobody else noticed. By noon, the visibility outside had dropped to maybe 60 feet. The mountain had completely disappeared. The resort had closed all lifts and was running a quiet, controlled shutdown, staff moving with purpose, walkie-talkies, clicking the kind of organized urgency that didn't announce itself because announcing it would cause panic. Mr. Sterling had not noticed any of this. He was arguing with a lift operator about whether the advanced runs would reopen in the afternoon. Caleb had spent the last hour in the corner of the lodge, not skiing, watching the storm and thinking about his grandfather's voice, about the way the old man could look at the sky in August and tell you whether you had 4 hours or 40 minutes before the rain hit, about what he'd said once standing in a field while lightning was still 3 ridges away. The storm doesn't care what your plans are, boy. The storm only cares what you do next. He was still thinking about that when Sterling announced with zero awareness that they were packing up and heading back to the bus. The conditions had deteriorated beyond the resort's operational parameters, which was resort speak for the mountain is now trying to kill you and we have liability concerns. The evacuation to this bus took 12 minutes. Caleb counted. He was fourth in line, moving efficiently, his backpack on his borrowed jacket zipped to the collar. He boarded, found his seat, looked around the bus as the others piled in, and then he started counting. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was his job, because it was the thing his brain did, the farm boy's brain, the boy who checked the fence line every morning before school, who counted the cattle every evening before dark, who had learned that the difference between a bad day and a catastrophe was usually something you could have caught if you'd been paying attention. He counted 38 students. He counted again, 38. The bus was supposed to have 42. He told himself he'd miscounted. He counted again, then slower, moving his eyes down each row, each seat, each face. 38. And then he thought about which four were missing, and his brain went quiet and still in the way it did right before something bad happened, and he thought about who he'd seen in the lodge and who he'd seen boarding and who had been sitting in the back corner by herself all morning, not talking to anyone. He stood up. Mr. Sterling. Sterling was putting on his coat, talking to the other teacher, Ms. Vance, about something that clearly involved dinner reservations. Mr. Sterling. Sit down, Caleb. He'd remembered the name this time. Small mercy. I count 38 students. We should have 42. Sterling stopped, looked at him with the particular patience that adults reserve for children who were being inconvenient. I'm sure you miscounted. Everyone boarded. I counted 3 times, and I watched them board. Sit down. Can you count them yourself right now? It'll take 2 minutes. Sterling looked at Miss Vance. Ms. Vance looked at her clipboard, which Caleb could see from 3 rows back, did not contain an attendance sheet. She was holding it the way people held things when they wanted to look like they were in charge of something. I'll do a quick head count, Ms. Vance said. She counted. She got 38 on the first pass. She counted again and got 39, which told Caleb she'd counted herself and started over and got 38 again. She looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at the front of the bus, then at the storm outside, then at his watch. Who's missing? Caleb said. That's the question. Who are we not seeing right now? I'm sure they're in the bathroom, Sterling said. The bathroom's at the lodge. They'd have to go back and sim out to check. Then we'll wait 5 minutes. We've been on the bus for 8 minutes already, Caleb said. If someone's in the bathroom, they'd have been back by now. Sterling's jaw tightened. Sit down. Caleb sat down. But he didn't stop thinking. He ran through faces, names, seats. He was not the kind of student who knew everyone's name at Hargrove. He existed on the margins. But he remembered patterns. He remembered where people sat. He remembered who had been standing where and who had been missing from where they usually were. In the corner of the lodge, the dark jacket, the girl who scanned rooms like she was looking for exits. He was back on his feet before he'd made the decision consciously. Raven Wolf is not on this bus. That landed differently than the others. Not because Sterling suddenly cared more, but because the name went through the bus like a current. He heard it pass from seat to seat in whispers. Wolf, Wolf, the Wolf girl. She's not here. And the whispers had that particular energy that came not from concern, but from the specific thrill that privileged teenagers got from proximity to danger that wasn't happening to them. Sterling turned around, fully this time. I'm sure she was sitting in the back left corner of the lodge all morning, Caleb said. Alone, not with any group. When you announced we were leaving, I was in the line toward the front. I did not see her in the line. I did not see her board. Maybe she boarded early. She's not on the bus, Mr. Sterling. I've counted every face. You don't know every face. I know she's not here because she is the only student in this school who eats alone every single day, which means I know exactly what she looks like and exactly where she positions herself in any room because I do the same thing. And she is not on this bus. Silence. The kind that happened when someone had said something truer than the conversation was prepared for. Sterling stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ms. Vance. Then he looked at the storm. We'll radio the lodge, he said. She's probably still inside. It took 4 minutes to reach the lodge's front desk by radio. Another 2 minutes while the desk attendant walked the building. Caleb sat in his seat with his hands flat on his thighs and counted seconds. Not because counting would help, because it was the only thing that kept the feeling in his chest from becoming something he couldn't control. The radio crackled. The desk attendant's voice came back thin and static cut. "She's not in the building. We've checked all the public areas. She's not here." Something happened to the air inside the bus. Sterling said, "Check again." "Sir, we've checked twice. The student is not in the lodge." Ms. Vance made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Caleb was already pulling his backpack from the floor. "What are you doing?" Prescott said from across the aisle, watching him with the casual fascination of someone observing an experiment. "Going to find her." "You can't go out there. Look at the storm." "I know." "Sterling's going to call Ski Patrol." Ski Patrol has been pulling back from the upper mountain for the last 2 hours. Their response time in this is going to be 40 minutes minimum, and that's if they can even mobilize. He stood up. "She's been outside for at least 15 minutes that we know of. Probably longer. The temperature is in the single digits and dropping. Wind chill is doing the rest." "How do you know any of that?" "Because I grew up on a farm and I've been watching the storm all day." He was at the front of the bus before Sterling moved to stop him. "Sit. Down." Sterling said it with his whole body, this time stepping into the aisle. "Ski Patrol has been notified. This is their job. You are a student. You will stay on this bus. She'll be dead before they get there." "That is not your call." "No," Caleb said. "It's yours, and you're making it wrong." He watched Sterling's face go through something complicated. Embarrassment, anger, fear buried underneath both. The man was not cruel. He was not heartless. He was just a person who had organized his entire professional life around the assumption that rules existed so individuals wouldn't have to make hard choices. And the hard choice was standing in front of him now, wearing a too-short jacket and a paperclip backpack, and he did not know what to do with it. "You step off this bus," Sterling said quietly, "and you are responsible for yourself. I cannot authorize this. I cannot protect you. Do you understand me?" Caleb looked at him for one more second. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand." And he stepped off the bus into the white. The cold hit him the way it always hit people who weren't ready for it all at once, everywhere, a total system shock. But Caleb was ready. He had grown up in New Hampshire winters. He had spent mornings at 4 a.m. breaking ice from water troughs in temperatures that made this feel warm by comparison. He pulled his collar up, tightened his backpack straps, and started moving. He did not panic. Panic was for people who hadn't made the decision before the moment arrived. Caleb had made this decision before he stepped off the bus. He had made it the moment the radio came back empty. He had a knife in his backpack. He had a length of paracord 200 feet because his grandfather had told him years ago that you never went anywhere unfamiliar without rope. He had a fire-starting kit in a waterproof case, a foil emergency blanket, 2 protein bars, a small folding saw, and a water filter. He carried these things not because he'd expected a blizzard. He carried them because his grandfather had taught him that preparedness was not about expecting disasters. It was about respecting the possibility that the world might not cooperate with your plans. He had 30 seconds of visibility, maybe less. He stood at the edge of the parking lot and thought hard and fast. If she had gone outside, she had a reason. She wouldn't have wandered. She was too deliberate for that. She'd gone looking for something. Signal, probably the phones had been cutting in and out all morning inside the lodge. There was a ridge above the parking area, not steep, where you could sometimes get a bar or two. He'd noticed it coming in because he was always noticing things that most people didn't bother with. He moved toward the ridge. The wind was hitting him broadside. He leaned into it and kept moving, counting steps. 20, 40, 100. He stayed low and kept his face turned slightly to minimize exposure. He was breathing through his nose slow and controlled, the way you breathed when the cold was trying to convince your body to shut down. At 120 steps, he found the first sign. Footprints, already filling in the snow, moving to erase them the way it erased everything eventually, but still there. Small boots, pointed uphill. He followed them without stopping. At 200 steps, the footprints turned right toward the tree line, which made his stomach drop slightly because that was away from the lodge and deeper into territory the storm could work with. At 270 steps, the footprints stopped being readable. The storm had taken them. He stopped, breathed, let his grandfather's voice come into his head. When you lose the trail, you don't panic and you don't guess. You stop. You think about what the animal was doing and where it was going and what it needed. Then you move with purpose. She'd been heading uphill for signal. Then she'd shifted right, which meant she'd found a spot that didn't work and was moving to try another angle. The tree line to the right offered a break from the wind, which meant if she was cold and disoriented, her instincts would have taken her there, into the trees out of the wind. Into the trees. He moved right. 60 feet into the tree line, he stopped moving and started listening instead. The storm was loud, a constant, deep roar that flattened individual sounds. But underneath it, if you knew how to filter, if you had learned as a child to hear the specific sound of a calf that had separated from the herd in a winter field, you could sometimes catch something that didn't fit the noise. He heard it. Not a voice, not a cry, a sound, low and rhythmic, something that could have been wind through branches but wasn't quite, because wind through branches had a pattern, and this didn't. He moved toward it. He found Ravenwolf 40 feet deeper in the trees, sitting at the base of a large pine, her back against the trunk, her knees pulled up, her head down. She was shaking. The kind of shaking that meant her body was in the early stages of shutting down the violent, whole-body tremble that was actually the body trying to generate heat, the last defense before it gave up trying. Her jacket was unzipped. He didn't know when that had happened, whether she'd unzipped it or whether it had come open. It didn't matter. Every minute she'd been out here, she'd been losing core temperature, and an unzipped jacket meant she'd been losing it faster than she should have. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Hey, look at me. Her head came up slowly. Her eyes were unfocused, the pupils wide and vague, which was not a good sign. Who are you? Her voice was slurred at the edges. I'm from school. My name is Caleb. I'm going to help you. I was looking for signal. She tried to gesture with one arm. The arm moved badly, imprecisely, like the connection between her brain and her body was going through interference. I know, he said. I know. Listen to me, okay? Look at my face. Keep looking at my face. Her eyes found his, stayed there with effort. Your name is Raven. You have hypothermia. We need to start warming you up right now. He was already pulling the emergency foil blanket from his pack, shaking it open, moving quickly but without urgency in his voice, because panic transferred. He knew that. He'd seen it with animals. If you came in panicked, they went deeper into shock. I'm going to wrap this around you, then I'm going to zip your jacket. Then we're going to figure out what to do next, okay? She didn't say anything. Her teeth were chattering so hard he could hear them separately from the wind. He wrapped the foil blanket around her shoulders and back, overlapping it at the front, zipped her jacket over it as best he could, took her hands, they were bare, her gloves somewhere in the trees or back at the lodge he'd never know, and pressed them between both of his. Her fingers were the color of old chalk. Can you feel that, he said. Can you feel my hands? A long pause. A little. Good, that's good, okay? We're going to work through this. The wind shifted and hit them with a gust that made the trees groan and drove the temperature down another 5 degrees in a single second. Caleb looked up. He looked at the sky. He could barely see through the canopy. He thought about the bus, about Mr. Sterling, and his radio about ski patrol with a 40-minute response time in conditions that were actively getting worse. He thought about the Quincy his grandfather had shown him how to build when he was 12 years old in the backfield. On a January afternoon, the old man, with his big weathered hands packing snow and explaining, not because they were in danger, but because he believed that knowing things was its own kind of safety. Caleb looked at the snow around them. He looked at Raven. He looked at how much time they probably had before her core temperature dropped another degree. He made his second irreversible decision of the day. Okay, he said more to himself than to her. Okay, here's what we're going to do. She looked at him with those clouded, struggling eyes, and something passed through her expression, not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of something, the door cracking open just enough to let the light in. We're not going back the way I came, he said. The visibility's too low and you're too cold to move that far. I'm going to build us a shelter. Right here. We're going to stay put, stay warm, and we're going to wait this out. A pause, the wind screamed, You know how to build a shelter. Her voice was still slurred, but there was something in it now. Something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Something that sounded like she was deciding to fight. My grandfather taught me, Caleb said. Yeah. Another pause. Then, okay. Just that. One word. But in the way she said it, quiet, deliberate, the sound of someone choosing to trust something they couldn't verify, it meant everything. He set down his pack and went to work. He found the deepest snowdrift within 10 feet of the pine tree, packed hard by the storm, dense enough to hold a hollow. He pulled out his folding saw and cut 3 pine branches each, about 4 feet long, using them as depth markers, pushing them into the snow, at the angle that would tell him when he'd carved enough interior depth for 2 bodies. His grandfather had called them angels. You put your angels in first, the old man had said, so you don't carve too deep and lose your roof. He started hollowing. It took 22 minutes. He knew because he counted, because counting kept him from thinking about what happened if he miscounted the depth, or if the storm escalated before he finished, or if Raven's core temperature had already dropped past the point where a snow shelter could bring it back. She watched him the whole time. He could hear her teeth. He could hear the foil blanket crackling when the wind moved it. Every few minutes he'd stop and check on her, say something simple. You still with me? And she'd answer something simple back, still here, and that was enough to keep them both oriented. When the hollow was deep enough, he helped her inside. It was not graceful. She could barely coordinate her limbs. He guided her in with his hands on her shoulders, kept her from hitting the ceiling, arranged her as far back from the entrance as the space allowed. Then he crawled in behind her, used the cut pine branches to build a partial wind block at the entrance, pulled the entrance as small as he could without collapsing it. The sound of the storm cut by 30% immediately. Raven exhaled, a long, shaking, relieved exhale. Oh, she said quietly. Yeah, Caleb said. It was warmer already. Not warm, but warmer. Snow was one of the best insulators in nature. His grandfather had told him that too. The same thing that can kill you, the old man said, can save you if you know how to ask it the right way. He pulled out his second protein bar, the first he'd already eaten in the lodge hours ago, and broke it in half. Eat this. She looked at it, then at him. You need it too. I've got another one. He didn't. Eat it. She ate it slowly, the way someone ate when their jaw muscles weren't fully cooperating. Caleb sat with his back against the wall of the hollow and thought about his grandfather and about the farm and about the mortgage notice his mother had been carrying, folded in her apron pocket for the past 3 weeks, trying not to let him see it. He thought about what it meant that he was here in a mountain blizzard in a snow cave he'd built with his hands sitting 2 feet from the daughter of the president of the Hells Angels. He thought about how none of this was what he'd expected from the ski trip. He thought about how in some way he couldn't fully articulate, yet being here useful, capable. The one who knew what to do when the situation turned serious felt more like himself than anything he'd felt in 8 months at Hargrove Academy. You're the scholarship kid, Raven said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't unkind. It was just a fact delivered the way she'd probably learned to deliver facts, without decoration, without softness, just directly. Yeah, he said. The one from the farm. My family has a farm. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed against their shelter, and the snow absorbed it. Why did you come out here? You didn't have to. You didn't have. Caleb thought about how to answer that. He thought about Mr. Sterling's face, about the radio crackling back, empty, about the arithmetic 15-minute single digits, wind chill core temperature that had been running in his head from the moment he had understood she was out there. Because the math only had one answer, he finally said. She looked at him sideways. Her shaking had slowed, which was good. Her color was still wrong, but better than it had been. What does that mean? It means I ran the numbers, and the only version where you were okay was the one where somebody came after you, and I was the only one who knew you were gone. A long silence. The hollow breathed around them, quiet and cold and somehow impossibly safer than anywhere else on the mountain. My dad's going to come looking for me, she said. Not proud, not threatening, just stating a fact the way she stated everything. When the school calls him, he's going to come. Caleb nodded. Good. He's going to come with the whole chapter. Also good. She studied him for a moment with those dark, complicated eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned to measure people quickly, who had learned that the wrong measurement could cost you everything. You're not scared of him. It wasn't quite a question. Should I be? Caleb said, a pause. Something moved through her expression. The door cracked open another inch. Most people are. I'm more scared of this storm right now, he said honestly. Your dad being scary is theoretical. The temperature being 17 degrees is not. Something happened in her face then. Something quiet and surprised the way a person looked when they had been waiting for fear and gotten something else entirely. She looked away back at the snow wall in front of her, and when she spoke again, her voice was slightly different, slightly less armored. What's your name again? Caleb, he said. Caleb Daniels. She nodded slowly. Okay. Caleb Daniels, she said. Okay. Outside, the storm hit the mountain with everything it had. The world above them was white and violent and completely indifferent to human plans. But inside the hollow they had carved from the cold, something small and stubborn was holding. Two people, a protein bar between them. The heat from two bodies slowly doing what fire would have done if fire had been possible. And somewhere far below the mountain, in a house in Manchester that had more security than most banks, a phone was ringing. The phone on Griswold's desk rang at 2:47 in the afternoon, and the man who answered it was not a father. He was a president. He picked up on the second ring the way he always did because showing urgency was the same as showing weakness. And Marcus Wolf had spent 30 years making sure the world never saw either. Wolf, one word, no greeting. The voice on the other end was Mr. Sterling, and Sterling was already falling apart before he finished his first sentence. And Grizz listened without interrupting, without asking him to slow down, without making a single sound until Sterling said the words, your daughter, and missing, and blizzard, in the same breath. Then the president of the Hells Angels said very quietly, say that again. Sterling said it again. And the man on the phone stopped being a president. Inside the snow cave, Caleb was counting Raven's breathing. Not because he was medical. Not because he had any training beyond what his grandfather had taught him in a field in January with the cattle watching from a fence. He was counting because breathing was the one thing he could measure, and measuring things was how he kept himself from going to the place where panic lived. He'd learned that at 11 years old the year the North Pasture flooded, and they lost 8 head of cattle in 2 days, and his grandfather had put him to work cataloging damage before the grief could take hold. Count what you can count, the old man had said. The rest will sort itself out, or it won't, but counting gives you something to do with your hands. Raven's breathing was shallow, 12 breaths per minute, which was low. Normal was 14 to 16. Low meant her body was still in conservation mode, still running on emergency settings, still trying to decide whether the investment in full function was worth the energy cost. She was warmer than she'd been. Not warm, but warmer. He could feel it in the air between them, in the way the shaking had gone from violent to intermittent, in the way her jaw had stopped chattering with that particular frequency that had sounded out in the trees like something breaking. You need to talk to me, he said. She turned her head. Why? Because if you fall asleep, your core temp view drops again. Talking keeps you conscious and it generates heat. He kept his voice even. Clinical almost. Because the clinical version of the truth was easier to accept than the emotional version. I don't care what we talk about. Just stay awake. A long pause. The wind pushed at the entrance of the cave and the pine branches he'd stacked there shifted and settled. What do you want to know? Anything. Start anywhere. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her eyes. They were clearer than they'd been when he'd found her. Which was the most important sign, the one that told him the emergency wasn't over. But the worst of it might be stepping back. I didn't want to come on this trip, she finally said. Me neither. That surprised her. He could see it. Then why did you? My grandfather told me to show up. He said showing up was the whole thing. He shifted his weight, pressed his shoulder more firmly against hers. Body heat was the only heat they had. He'd explained this matter-of-factly, and she'd accepted it with the kind of practical directness that told him she was her father's daughter in at least one way. Why didn't you want to come? She thought about it. Not the evasive kind of thinking where someone bought time before giving an answer they had already decided on. The real kind where the answer was somewhere complicated and they were actually trying to find it. Because I knew exactly how it would go, she said, and it went exactly that way. The avoiding, the watching them avoid me. She said it without self-pity, which made it land harder than self-pity would have. At least when people avoid me, I know what I'm dealing with. It's the ones who try that I can't figure out. The ones who try to what? Be nice, because of my dad. Because they're scared and they think if they're nice to me, it gets back to him somehow. Like I'm a relay station. She exhaled. I'd rather have honest distance than fake proximity. Caleb thought about that, about Prescott across the aisle who had looked at his jacket and looked away, about the lunch table that cleared itself. Yeah, he said, I understand that. She looked at him directly. You're not scared of being out here. I'm scared, he said. I'm just not panicking. Those are different things. What's the difference? Scared is information. Panicking is what happens when you stop using it. She stared at him for a moment with that measuring look. Then something in it shifted, not all the way, not the full distance, but enough. Where did you learn that? Same place I learned everything useful. My grandfather. He looked at the snow wall across from him. He died last spring, 8 months ago. Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind where someone was deciding how much to give back. I'm sorry, she said. He was ready. He said so. Caleb paused. I wasn't, but he was. The wind gusted hard and the temperature inside the cave dropped 2 degrees in the space of a single breath, and they both felt it and both automatically moved slightly closer together without discussing it. It was the practicality of survival. But it was also something else, the small, unplanned intimacy that emerged when 2 people were the only warm things in a cold world. Back on the bus, Mr. Sterling was on his 4th phone call in 20 minutes, and none of them were going well. Ski Patrol had confirmed they were mobilizing, but the team leader had been blunt in a way that Sterling had not been prepared for. In these conditions, our estimated reach to the upper tree line is 50 to 70 minutes. That's if the wind doesn't force another pullback. Sterling had asked what a pullback meant, and the team leader had said with practiced patience, it means the storm wins and we try again when it lets up. And then Sterling had stopped asking questions. He'd called the resort's emergency coordinator, who had called the county, who had said that mountain rescue was on standby, but that an active deployment was not yet warranted. He'd called the school's administration line, which had connected him to voicemail. He'd called Ms. Vance's cell phone, which was sitting on the seat beside him, having been left there when she'd gone back inside the lodge to coordinate with the resort staff. The bus driver, a man named Ray, who had been driving this route for 11 years, sat in his seat with his hands in his lap and said nothing. But Caleb had been watching the storm from the bus for the past hour, and he was not here anymore. And Ray kept looking at the door of the bus the way a person looked at the thing they'd last seen someone walk out of. From 3 rows back, Prescott Ashworth was looking at his phone. He'd been looking at it for 45 minutes. And for the last 30 of those minutes, he'd had nothing to look at because the signal had dropped to 0. But he kept looking at it because that was what you did when you were 17 and the situation was beyond you, and your phone had always been the thing that bridged the gap between not knowing and knowing. He thought about Caleb stepping off the bus. He thought about the way Caleb had said it. The math only has one answer, and how infuriating it was because it was the kind of thing that sounded simple and was actually devastating. The kind of statement that made you realize you'd been standing in front of the same math and deliberately not solving it. He thought about how Caleb Daniels had walked out into a whiteout blizzard alone for a girl he didn't know, and how Prescott had watched from a heated bus with his phone in his hand. He put the phone in his pocket and stared at the floor. In Manchester, the response was already in motion. Griswolf made 3 calls after he hung up with Sterling. The first was to his sergeant-at-arms, a man called Tank, who had done 2 tours in the mountains of Afghanistan and whose threat assessment skills were not theoretical. The second was to a man who ran a snowmobile operation out of Lincoln, New Hampshire, who owed Grizz a favor of the kind that didn't expire. The third was to the county sheriff's office, not to ask for help, but to inform them that the Hells Angels were conducting a search operation on Cascade Ridge and that any interference would be interpreted as obstruction. The sheriff's office did not interfere. By the time Grizz pulled on his gear, there were 11 members of his chapter assembled in the compound's parking area. Not the full chapter. The ones he'd called specifically riders with military backgrounds, riders who'd worked SAR operations in the past, riders who understood that finding someone in a mountain blizzard was not a matter of bravado, but of training equipment and speed. He stood in front of them for exactly 45 seconds. My daughter is on that mountain, he said. We're going in. Tank runs search pattern. Everybody else follows his call. This is not a show. This is a rescue. Anyone who can't separate those two things stays here. Nobody stayed. Inside the cave, something had shifted without either of them naming it. It happened gradually the way most important things happen, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones, each barely noticeable on its own, each adding weight to a balance that was slowly tipping towards something new. Raven had stopped shivering. She was still cold, her hands were still a color that wasn't right, but the violent, uncontrolled shaking had given way to a steadier, more manageable chill, and Caleb had decided this was the threshold. Not safe, but stable. There was a difference. She had started talking more freely in the last half hour. Not because she'd decided to trust him. Trusting Caleb's experience was never a decision so much as an accumulation. But because the cold and the dark and the sound of the storm and the strange intimacy of sharing body heat with a stranger in a space no bigger than a closet had dismantled something. Some of the armor, some of the distance. My dad wanted me to go to St. Catherine's, she said. Catholic boarding school in Vermont. All girls. Safe. She said the last word with a particular inflection. But I told him I wanted a real school, with boys, with people from different places. A pause. He cried when I told him I wanted to come to Hargrove. He didn't think I saw him, but I did. Caleb held that image in his head for a moment. A man the whole town was afraid of crying in a kitchen somewhere because his daughter wanted something he hadn't been able to give her. He loves you, Caleb said. Terrifyingly, she said. And then after a beat, that's supposed to be funny. I know, he said. It was. She almost smiled. He could see the edge of it. You're different than I expected. You expected something. I noticed you, she said. It came out simple and direct the way she said most things. At school, the corner table at lunch, the way you walked the halls like you were calculating the fastest route between 2 points. He hadn't known she'd noticed. He'd been invisible, or so he'd believed. Why? Because you look like me, she said. Except I take up space people are afraid of, and you take up space people ignore. And I could never figure out which one was lonelier. That one hit him somewhere unexpected. He didn't answer right away. Outside, the storm made a sound like something tearing high and sustained, and then it stopped, and the silence was almost worse. I think they're both the same kind of lonely, he finally said. Different walls, same room. She looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, she said, exactly like that. And then her eyes changed. It was subtle and it was instant, and Caleb caught it because he'd been watching her eyes as his primary indicator of her condition. The clarity that had been building for the last hour slipped not all the way back to where she'd been in the trees, but back like a tide pulling out. Her blink slowed. The tension around her jaw loosened in a way that wasn't relief. Hey, he said immediately. Hey, look at me. Her eyes found him. I'm okay. You're getting drowsy. I'm just tired. I know, but you can't sleep. I need you to know that. If you fall asleep, your body temperature keeps going down. He turned to face her more directly, put both hands on her arms. Not gentle, deliberate. What's your middle name? She blinked. What? Middle name, right now. A pause. Elaine, after my mom's mother. Where's your mom now? Something crossed her face. Fast, but he caught it. She left when I was 6. We don't talk about that. Okay, tell me about the last thing you were happy about, before the trip. She stared at him. That's a weird question. Tell me anyway. A slow exhale. She was fighting the drowsiness. He could see the effort, could see her pulling herself back from the edge of it. I finished a painting, she said, 3 weeks ago. My dad has this wall in his office where he puts things I've made since I was little. There's 32 things on that wall. He counted them once, in front of me, like it was the most important inventory he'd ever done. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. He kept his voice steady. What was the painting of the farm road out on Route 9, the one with the stone walls on both sides? She paused. I drive past it sometimes in the fall. I don't know why it got to me. It just looked like somewhere that had decided what it was and wasn't pretending. He looked at her. A road with stone walls. Yeah. I drive past that road, he said slowly. Going to school. That road is 2 miles from my family's farm. She went still. Not the drowsy, drifting stillness of before. the alert kind, the kind that meant something had just resolved. You're serious. Yeah. The silence between them was different after that. The kind of silence that happened when two people had just discovered that the world was smaller and stranger than they'd been accounting for, and neither of them quite knew what to do with that information yet. Then Raven said, "Is your family's farm okay? I heard some of the scholarship kids talking about there was something about a bank situation." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Where'd you hear that?" "At school. I hear things. People don't watch what they say around me because they don't think I'm paying attention to their world." She met his eyes. "Is it bad?" A long pause. He'd never said it out loud, not to anyone his age. His mother didn't talk about it. His grandfather was gone. The farm debt was something he carried alone, a weight in the center of his chest that he'd gotten so used to he sometimes forgot it was there until something pressed on it. "Yay," he said. "It's bad. My mom's trying to hold on, but the second mortgage came due in December, and we got an extension through March. After March, I don't know." "I'm sorry," she said. And then the way she said everything directly without ornament. "That's really unfair." "Yeah. My dad would say the bank's the real criminal. He'd say that about a lot of things." A pause. "He's not wrong about everything." "I know he's not," Caleb said. "That's actually the easy part. Nobody's wrong about everything." She almost laughed. It was brief and genuine and completely unexpected, and it went through the hollow like something warm. "I like how you think," she said. "It's very farm." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," she said. "But yes." Outside, the storm had not lessened. If anything, the sound had deepened, the wind, moving through a lower register that Caleb associated from experience with the part of a winter storm when it stopped being loud and started being serious. When it stopped trying to impress you and started trying to outlast you. He fed another notch of paracord around the pine branch barrier at the entrance, pulling the gap tighter. Every inch of opening was a degree of temperature. Every degree of temperature was a margin between stable and declining. He was running calculations constantly the way his grandfather had calculated cattle weights in hay stores and pasture space, not with a calculator, but with the practiced intuition of someone who'd spent a lifetime converting physical reality into numbers and numbers back into decisions. They had maybe 6 hours of night ahead. The storm's behavior suggested it would peak in the next 2 to 3 hours and then begin pulling back. He'd felt storms like this before, knew their architecture, the slow build, the hard peak, the stubborn trailing edge. If they could hold through the peak, the trailing edge would be manageable. "My dad is already looking for me," Raven said. It was not a question, and it was not comfort-seeking. It was a fact she was filing the way she filed all facts, in the precise place where it was most useful. "He has protocols. He told me when I started at Hargrove. He told me that if I was ever in trouble and unreachable, there was a protocol. He'd know. He'd come." "What kind of protocols does the president of the Hells Angels have for his daughter being late to call?" "The kind that involve a lot of people moving very fast." She paused. "The kind that involved him spending 3 hours once explaining to me that having a father people were afraid of was both a protection and a prison, and that he was sorry for the prison, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure the protection was worth it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like my grandfather," he said. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Open, actually open the armor, not just cracked, but set aside at least for this moment, in this cave, in this cold. "That's the nicest thing anyone's said about him in a while," she said. He looked back at her. He thought about the farm, about the mortgage, about his mother in the kitchen reading the bank letter, about his grandfather's voice in his head, which had been there all day, which had been there all year, guiding him through things the old man hadn't specifically prepared him for, but had somehow equipped him for anyway. "Your dad's going to find us," Caleb said. "And when he does, everything's going to change, and the moment's going to be loud and big and chaotic. So I just want to say this now while it's quiet." He looked at her directly. "You're stronger than the people at that school give you credit for. The way you fought back out there in the trees, not many people fight like that when their body's already telling them to give up." She held his gaze for a moment. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with cold. "You came for me," she said. "I'm not going to forget that. I didn't do it for anything." "I know," she said. "That's why I won't forget it." The wind screamed. The mountain pressed down on all sides. And in the hollow they'd carved from the cold, something that had started as survival was becoming something else. The kind of thing that didn't have a clean name yet, that existed in the space between two people who had each been alone in their own way, and had stopped being alone, at least for tonight, at least in this. Caleb kept his shoulder pressed to hers and listened to the storm and counted her breaths. 11, 12, 13. Still there, still fighting. He wasn't going to let it take her. Not on his watch. Not tonight. And somewhere down the mountain, engines were warming up. Headlights were cutting through the dark. And a man whose name people said like a warning was moving through a blizzard with the controlled, purposeful fury of someone who'd promised his daughter something and intended to keep it. The night was just beginning. Raven went under at 9:47. Not all the way, not the deep, dangerous sleep that Caleb had been fighting to keep her from for the past 3 hours. But her eyes closed in the middle of a sentence she'd been talking about the painting again, about the stone walls on Route 9, about how she'd used a palette knife instead of a brush for the mortar lines because she wanted the texture to feel real, and then the words just stopped. The way a radio stopped when someone pulled the plug and her head dropped forward 2 inches before her body caught it. Caleb had her by both shoulders before she finished falling. Raven. He shook her not gently. Raven, open your eyes. A second, 2, the longest 2 seconds of his life, and he'd had some long ones this year. Her eyes opened, unfocused first, then finding him, then sharpening into something that was still Raven, still that particular quality of attention she had, the one that made you feel like you were being read rather than just looked at. I wasn't sleeping, she said immediately. You were starting to. I was resting my eyes. Your eyes cannot rest right now. I need them open. He kept his hands on her shoulders, kept his voice at the exact register he'd learned from watching his grandfather work cattle, calm enough to not escalate, firm enough to land. Talk to me. Right now. What year were you born? That's condescending. What year? A pause. The glare she gave him was genuine and annoyed, and the most reassuring thing he'd seen in hours because annoyance required full cognitive function. 2004, she said. You're 2 years older than me. You looked me up. I noticed the scholarship documentation on the corkboard outside the guidance office. It listed enrollment years. She shifted, pulling herself more upright, clearly angry at her own body for betraying her. Stop looking at me like that. Like what? Like I'm a patient. You are a patient. I'm a person who got cold. There's a difference. There's less of a difference than you think at the moment, he said, but he released her shoulders because the point had been made, and she was back, and pressing harder would only make her fight him. He'd learned that too with animals. You could lead something out of danger or you could drag it, but dragging used energy neither of them had. He pressed the back of his hand to the side of her neck. Temperature check. She'd let him do this twice now without comment, which told him she understood the necessity, even if she didn't like it. She was warmer than she'd been at 9 o'clock. Not normal, but warmer. Her circulation was working. Her core was holding. The problem was the night was nowhere near done. He checked his mental clock. Close to 10 hours since they'd left the lodge. The storm had peaked somewhere in the last 45 minutes. He could feel it the way you felt a fever breaking. Not in the thing itself, but in the quality of the air around it. The peak violence had passed. What remained was endurance, the long tail of a mountain blizzard that could last until 4 in the morning, or until 6, or until the sun came up and made it irrelevant. Tell me something I don't know about you, he said. Something real. She looked at him sideways. We're doing this again. We're doing this until I'm confident you don't need me to shake you anymore. She exhaled, long and slow. He watched her chest rise and fall and counted 14 breaths per minute, which was the most normal number he'd gotten from her all night. And he cataloged it the way he cataloged everything in the inventory his grandfather had taught him to keep running at all times when things were serious. I wanted to be a marine biologist, she said, when I was 9. What happened at 10? I met the ocean. She said it flat deadpan, and then the corner of her mouth moved. It was just the Atlantic, Cape Ann. My dad took me on the back of his bike when I was 10 years old, just the two of us, 4 hours each way. And we stood on the rocks and watched the water, and he said, she stopped. What did he say? A pause. The kind that meant the memory was the kind you held carefully. He said, Raven, most people spend their whole life being afraid of something big. The ones who make it are the ones who figure out the big thing is on their side. And then he pointed at the ocean. She was quiet for a moment. I was 9. I didn't know what he meant, but I remembered it. Do you know what he meant now? She thought about it seriously the way she thought about everything. I think he meant that size isn't the enemy, that the thing you're afraid of isn't automatically against you, that fear and danger aren't the same thing. Caleb let that sit. He thought about the storm, about the snow pressing in from all sides, the same snow that was trying to kill them being the thing that was keeping them alive. The insulation, the walls, his grandfather's voice, the same thing that can kill you can save you if you know how to ask it the right way. Yeah, he said, he's right. She looked at him. You'd like him. I think I would. He'd like you too. She said it simply without calculation. He respects people who do things. He has no patience for people who talk about doing things. What does he do when he's not? Caleb paused, choosing words. Running a motorcycle club. She said it for him without defensiveness. He builds furniture. In the garage. Late at night when he thinks the house is asleep. He made my bed frame when I was 7. He made the dining room table. He made a rocking chair that took him 6 months. And he gave it to the woman next door when her husband died because he said she looked like she needed somewhere to be still. Caleb stared at her. I know, she said, reading him accurately. It doesn't fit the image. No, he said honestly. It doesn't. That's the thing about images, she said. They're built to keep people from looking closer. She met his eyes. You of all people should know that. He did know that. He knew it from the inside out. The scholarship kid, the farm boy, the one who didn't belong. The image that Hargrove had collectively assembled of Caleb Daniels in 8 months consisted of poor, quiet, harmless, irrelevant. Not a person, a category. And yet here he was on a mountain in a blizzard keeping someone alive with knowledge that no one at that school had thought to value. And the gap between what they'd seen and what was actually true was so large, it would take years for him to stop being angry about it. Yeah, he said, I know. The wind found a new angle than coming from above, rather than the side pressing down on the roof of their shelter with a weight that made the snow creak. Caleb put his hand flat on the ceiling, feeling for structural give. It held. He'd built it right compact with a thick crown and a deliberate air pocket at the peak. His grandfather had been specific about the air pocket. Without the pocket, your breath has nowhere to go. Carbon dioxide builds up and you get headaches, then confusion, then you stop waking up. He'd been 12 years old when he'd been taught this. He thought at the time it was the old man being excessive. He thought about that now, kneeling in a snow cave on a mountain in the dark, and he had an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between grief and gratitude that lived in the same place. Is the ceiling okay? Raven asked. She'd felt him tense. It's fine, just checking. You check things a lot. Yes. Is that a farm thing or a you thing? He thought about it. Both, he said. My grandfather used to say that a checked fence is a safe fence and an unchecked fence is a prayer. He said prayers were fine, but they worked better when paired with inspection. She made a sound that was mostly laugh and partly something warmer than laugh. I'm going to need to write that down. He had a lot of them. Tell me another one. He looked at the ceiling, at the snow walls, at her face, which was the most important surface in this cave, the one he kept returning to the way you returned to a compass, checking orienting, confirming the thing that mattered most was still pointing the right direction. He said the measure of a person wasn't how they acted when things went their way. It was what they found out about themselves when things didn't. Raven was quiet for a long moment. What are you finding out? She asked. It surprised him, not the question itself, but the directness of it, the way she asked the thing most people danced around because asking it required you to accept the answer. That I'm steadier than she thought, he said, and that being steady for someone else is easier than being steady for yourself. Because when it's for yourself, you can negotiate, she said. Yeah, exactly. She nodded slowly. What am I finding out? That's yours to answer. A long pause. The storm moved. The cave held. That I've been waiting for someone to see me the way my dad sees me, she said quietly. Not the name, not the reputation. Me. And I thought that meant I had to go somewhere my dad wasn't. Somewhere the name didn't reach. She stopped, started again. But I've been at Hargrove for 2 years and nobody's looked yet. And you've been there for 8 months and you looked on the first day. Caleb didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Some things close themselves. He checked the time in his head. Close to 11. At least 7 more hours until full light. The storm's tail was going to be the test. The trailing edge of a mountain blizzard had a particular cruelty, the way it mimicked ending without actually ending, lulling you into thinking the worst was over and then hitting you with something cold and unexpected. He needed to stay awake. Raven needed to stay awake. And he was running out of protein bar. He ate the last third of his own. He'd been rationing it since 10 o'clock. Small bites spaced 30 minutes apart, enough sugar to keep his brain running without depleting the reserve. And he thought about the bus, about whether Sterling had reached ski patrol, about whether the resort had escalated to county search and rescue, about all the systems and protocols that existed for exactly this kind of situation and that were from inside this cave completely invisible and possibly completely irrelevant. He thought about Grizz Wolf. He thought about what Raven had said. He has protocols, he'd come. And he thought about what those protocols looked like from the outside, what it meant when the president of a motorcycle club activated his network for a mountain search. He thought about the kind of men who would be moving through this storm right now on that man's word. Men who had done harder things in worse conditions. Men who moved with purpose rather than procedure. He found himself hoping quietly and without irony that Grizz Wolf was exactly as formidable as his reputation. Then Raven said, "Caleb," and her voice had changed again. He was looking at her before she finished the word. Her face had gone tight, not the drowsy loosening of before, the tightening of someone who felt something wrong and was trying to assess it before saying it out loud. She had one hand pressed flat against her sternum. "What?" he said. "My chest." She took a breath, shallow, careful. There's a pressure. He felt everything in him go quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Chest pressure and hypothermia. He knew what that could mean. He knew the list: cardiac arrhythmia, the heart struggling to maintain rhythm, in low core temperature, the muscle itself beginning to misfire as the cold reached it. He also knew it could be anxiety, could be the position she'd been sitting in, could be the ribs compressed by the foil blanket. "Rate it," he said, 1 to 10. 3, she said, then maybe 4. "Is it getting worse right now or staying the same?" She held still with the 3 seconds that lasted approximately forever. "Same, not worse." "Okay." He moved to sit directly in front of her, both hands on her arms, watching her face. "Breathe with me. Slow. In through your nose, 4 counts. Out through your mouth, 6 counts. She looked at him. "You think it's my heart. I think it could be several things, and most of them are manageable, and I need you to breathe with me so I can assess. Can you do that?" She held his gaze for 1 beat, and then she nodded, and they breathed together. Him counting aloud, her following the rhythm of it, filling the hollow, with something that was almost deliberately peaceful, a chosen calm imposed on a situation that wanted to be chaos. After 2 minutes, she said, "It's less." He exhaled, slowly so she wouldn't see the full extent of what that information did to him. "Good. Keep breathing that way." "What was it?" "Most likely anxiety response. Your body's been in fight or flight for hours. Sometimes the chest tightens." He kept his voice even. "Your heart rate feels okay. I'd know from your pulse if something was seriously wrong." He'd had 2 fingers on her wrist for the past 5 minutes. 72 beats per minute. Low but steady. "You're okay. You're sure right now in this moment?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "I won't lie to you about your condition. I promise you that." She searched his face for the lie anyway, the way she searched everything with that particular Raven Wolf attention that missed nothing. Then she relaxed by a fraction. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They stayed like that, him with his fingers on her wrist, her breathing slow and deliberate for another 10 minutes. And somewhere in that 10 minutes, the pressure in his own chest eased as her color came back and her breathing steadied, and the crisis, if it had been a crisis, passed back under the surface. He didn't remove his fingers from her wrist. She didn't tell him to. The twist came at 11:43. He heard it before he understood it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, that had a different character from the wind and the snow and the groaning cold, high and intermittent, a frequency with intention behind it, a radio. He went completely still. Raven felt the change in him instantly. "What?" she whispered. "Listen." She listened. 3 seconds. Is that? Radio, search frequency. He was already moving toward the entrance of the cave, pulling the pine branches ascending, carefully opening the gap just enough to get his face close to the outside air. The cold hit him like a slap. He pushed through it and listened. There it was again. Closer. A radio burst words chopped by wind, but with the clipped, deliberate cadence of people using communication protocol. People who knew how to work in bad conditions. People who were organized. Not ski patrol. Ski patrol used a specific tone pattern he knew from the mountain operations section of a wilderness survival book he'd read at 14. This was different, more compact, less institutional. His heart did something he didn't have a name for exactly. "Your dad," he said. He turned back to look at her. "I think that's your dad." Raven's face did something then that he'd never seen on it before. A full unguarded thing, pure and sudden, all the architecture gone for just 1 second. The face underneath all the distance and the armor and the measuring quiet, just a 20-year-old girl hearing that her father was in the dark 100 yards away looking for her. "He came," she said. "He came," Caleb said. He turned back to the entrance, took his brightest item, the foil emergency blanket, and began working it through the gap, moving it in a slow, deliberate pattern. Signal. The foil would catch any ambient light, any flashlight beam, any headlamp. It was not a flare, but it was the best he had, and it was something, and something was always better than nothing. "Should we call out?" Raven asked. "Not yet. I need to know which direction. Calling randomly in these acoustics could send them the wrong way." He kept moving the foil. "Give me 30 seconds. 20 seconds and a light swept the tree line 40 feet to their left. Stopped. Swept back. Caleb pulled the foil back through the gap and filled his lungs. "Here!" he shouted as loud as he'd ever shouted anything in his life, the sound coming from somewhere below his ribs from the same place his grandfather's voice lived. "We're here straight ahead from the light." Silence. Then a voice deep and controlled cutting through the storm like it had been doing this for years. Sound off again. "Here, 20 feet north of the tree line. Snow shelter. 2 people. 30 seconds. The longest 30 seconds. Then the sound of boots on compacted snow moving fast and a light that grew from ambient to direct. And the branches at the entrance of the cave were pulled aside from outside with a single powerful motion, and a face appeared in the opening. Not Grizz, but a man with a military build and a headlamp and an expression that cycled through assessment relief and professional control in the span of about 1 second. "I've got them," the man said into his radio, not at Caleb at the air. "Tree line north sector, both conscious, shelter intact." Then he looked at Caleb, really looked the quick, thorough appraisal of someone trained to read situations. "You build this?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "That's a Quincy." "Yes, sir." The man nodded once slow, like something had been confirmed that he'd suspected. "How long in here?" "Approximately 6 hours. She had moderate to advanced hypothermia when I found her. Core temp has been recovering for the last 4 hours. Breathing stabilized around 2300. Chest pressure, episode around 2343, that resolved with controlled breathing." The man stared at him. "How old are you?" 20. Another pause. "You farm?" "Yes, sir, New Hampshire. My grandfather taught me cold weather survival." The man was quiet for one more beat. Then he said to the radio, "Tell Wolf I've got his daughter, she's stable, and tell him there's a kid in here he's going to want to meet." From somewhere outside, not far, maybe 30 feet, came a sound that Caleb felt in his sternum. Not a word, not a command, just a sound rough and involuntary and containing everything that a man who had spent 30 years being afraid of nothing had never intended to let anyone hear from him. Raven heard it too. "Dad," she said, not loud, not asking, just placing the word where it belonged. "Can she move?" the man with the headlamp asked Caleb. "With support, don't let her rush it. Her legs have been stationary for 6 hours and her circulation isn't fully normalized." He nodded, reached into the cave with a large, steady hand. "Raven, I'm Tank. Your dad sent me first because he's right behind me. Take my hand." She took his hand. And then the cave that had been their whole world for 6 hours was dismantled by degrees. Raven guided out Caleb, following the pine branches scattered the hollow that had held them through the worst of the night, exposed to the open air, and immediately beginning to lose the warmth they'd spent hours building. Caleb stood up outside for the first time in 6 hours, and the cold hit him completely. and he felt every hour of it in his legs and his back and his hands, the accumulated debt of holding still and holding temperature and holding someone else's life in his attention for that entire span. He didn't fall. He stood. And then the trees parted and Griswold came through them. Caleb had formed an image from the reputation and from what Raven had told him, and from the particular way people at Hargrove went quiet when the name was said. He'd expected something large and performed the way dangerous things were often large and performed. What came through the trees was not performed. Griswold was a big man, not theatrical about it, just built the way some men were built, with a density that went beyond size. He wore gear that was functional rather than impressive, moved with a coordination that spoke to someone who had crossed difficult terrain before under worse conditions than this. His face, when Caleb got a clear look at it in the headlamp light, was the face of a man who had been doing math for the past 10 hours and had not liked any of the answers and was now looking at a result that was better than the worst of them. He went straight to Raven. No performance. No announcement. He put both hands on her face and looked at her for 3 full seconds, checking the same way Caleb had been checking, with the specific practiced attention of someone who had learned that looking carefully was the only thing between you and losing something you couldn't replace. "You're okay," he said, low, certain, not a question. "I'm okay," she said. "You're sure?" "Dad, I'm okay." He held her face for 1 more second. Then he pulled her into him. Not gently, not carefully, with the full weight of 6 hours of controlled terror, finally having somewhere to go. And she went in without resistance, and the two of them stood there in the middle of a mountain blizzard at midnight, and were just a father and a daughter, with all the complexity of what that meant in their particular lives stripped back to nothing but the core of it. Caleb looked away. It wasn't his moment. He stood with Tank, who handed him a thermal pack without comment, and he pressed it between his palms and let the heat move up through his hands and into his arms, and he looked at the mountain around them, the trees he'd moved through, in zero visibility, the path he'd tracked, the shelter he'd built, and he thought about his grandfather, about the voice that had been in his head all day, and he said very quietly to no one in particular, "I hope you saw that old man." Tank said from beside him, "You said your grandfather taught you, yeah, he taught you right." "I know," Caleb said, and for the first time all day his voice wasn't completely steady, just for that 1 second. Then it was again. Griswold stepped back from Raven. He turned. His eyes found Caleb with the same directness. His daughter had the family resemblance, undeniable in that particular quality of looking total without deflection, uncomfortable with dishonesty. He studied Caleb for a long moment. The farm jacket, the broken zipper replaced by a paper clip, the hands that were still pressed around the thermal pack, the face of a 20-year-old kid who had walked out of a heated bus into a blizzard alone and had done apparently everything right. "You built the shelter," Grizz said. "Yes, sir." "And kept her temperature up?" "Yes, sir." 6 hours. "Approximately, yes." Grizz nodded, not the dismissive kind of nod, the settling kind, the kind you made when information confirmed a conclusion you'd already reached through other means. He looked at Raven. She was looking back at him with that expression Caleb had only seen once before, full unguarded, all the architecture down. "He came for me," she said, "when nobody else did." Grizz looked at Caleb again. "What's your name, son?" "Caleb Daniels." "Daniels," he turned the name over. "You're on scholarship. Route 9, New Hampshire. Farm family." Caleb blinked. "How did you—" "I know every student at that school," Grizz said simply. Not threatening, just fact. "I know who goes there with my daughter and who doesn't, and I know which ones might matter and which ones won't. I had your family checked when the scholarship list was posted." He paused. "I know about the mortgage." The temperature around Caleb dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. "That's our business," he said quietly. "It is," Grizz agreed. "I'm not here about your business. I'm here because my daughter is standing in front of me on a mountain in the middle of winter instead of in the ground, and she says you're the reason." He stepped forward 1 step and held out his hand. The hand of a man who had built furniture and given rocking chairs to grieving neighbors and cried in the kitchen when his daughter chose her own school. "So I'm saying thank you, that's all." Caleb looked at the hand, then he took it. Grizz's grip was exactly what you'd expect from a man like that, total unhurried present. He held for 3 seconds and released. "We're going to get you both off this mountain," he said, And then we're going to talk. Caleb nodded. Raven from beside her father caught his eye. She mouthed something. He read it without difficulty. I told you he'd come. He almost smiled. He would have smiled if his face hadn't been too cold to do it correctly. But it was there the thing that would have been a smile in a warmer world, in a less impossible situation. It was there. And around them the storm began finally slowly to pull back. They came off the mountain at 1:17 in the morning. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in movies where the rescue was a single defining moment with music underneath it and people standing at the bottom with blankets and tears and everything resolved in a clean visual frame. It happened the way real things happened in stages with difficulty, with the body's accumulated debt from 6 hours of cold demanding payment in the form of legs that didn't cooperate and hands that couldn't grip properly, and a kind of bone-deep exhaustion that went past physical into something that didn't have a clean name. Tank went first, breaking trail. 2 other members of the chapter came behind, men whose names Caleb didn't have yet, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done extractions in conditions that made this look manageable. Grizz kept one hand on Raven's arm the entire way down, not guiding her, not carrying her, just there. The way a wall was there, not directing you, but present, something solid to orient against if the ground went wrong. Caleb walked beside Tank without assistance. He'd refused it when offered, not from pride, but from the practical calculation that his legs worked and other people's energy was better spent on Raven. Tank had looked at him sideways when he said this, and then nodded, which told Caleb that Tank was the kind of man who respected the difference between stubborn and strategic. The road down took 41 minutes. Caleb counted. He counted because counting was what kept his brain running when his body was trying to shut down into recovery mode. And he needed his brain running for another few hours yet because the night wasn't over. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered beyond the physical. The ranger station sat at the base access road, a low functional building that the resort used for coordination during mountain operations. By the time Caleb and Raven came through the door, it had been converted by the resort's emergency coordinator into something between a first aid station and a command center. There were 2 paramedics counting not resort who had arrived while the search was active and who now moved on Raven with the brisk, no negotiation efficiency of people with a clear job to do. Raven endured this with remarkable patience, which Caleb attributed to the fact that she'd been enduring it from him for 6 hours and had already accepted the basic premise that her body was currently not her own private business. He sat in a chair near the wall and let his own body run its inventory. His hands were numb from mid-finger down and tingled badly when the warmth of the building started working on them. His left knee, which had taken the full impact of the ground twice during the descent when the footing went wrong, had a particular quality of pain that told him it would be unhappy about stairs tomorrow. His lips were cracked and tasted like blood. He was in total fine, operational. He'd been colder before in worse conditions on the farm alone without anyone knowing where he was. That thought arrived with a quiet weight, without anyone knowing where he was. He'd spent most of his life that way. It was interesting that the night he'd almost died was the first night in a long time he'd felt completely oriented. Mr. Sterling appeared from around the partition on the far side of the station. He looked like a man who had been through something that had rearranged his understanding of himself, and who wasn't sure whether the rearrangement was complete or still in progress. His tie was loosened, his color was bad. He had the particular posture of someone who had been making decisions and phone calls for 6 hours and had slowly, call by call, become aware that every decision had been wrong. He saw Caleb. He stopped. Caleb looked back at him steadily, without hostility, without warmth. Just the look. Sterling crossed the room. He stood in front of Caleb and opened his mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. And what came out was, is Raven. She's going to be okay, Caleb said. She had moderate hypothermia when I found her. Core temperature has been recovering for the last 4 hours. The paramedics are with her now. Sterling exhaled. The full weight of it all, 6 hours of it in a single breath. He sat down in the empty chair beside Caleb without being invited and put his face in his hands for a moment, which was the most honest thing Caleb had ever seen the man do. I should have listened to you, Sterling said, into his hands, not performing it, just saying it. Caleb let the silence run for a beat. Yeah, he said, when you said she wasn't on the bus, you should have counted the students yourself before we left the lodge, Caleb said. Not brutal, just factual. That's the protocol. Every teacher knows it. Count heads before departure, count again before the bus moves. He paused. We moved before the second count happened. Sterling looked at him. His eyes were red at the edges. You're right. I know. Another silence. Outside, the storm was still audible, a distant sulking presence, the tail of it dragging across the mountain. What you did out there? Sterling started. I did what needed doing, Caleb said, because no one else was going to. Sterling nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, something that might have mattered, might have been the start of something real between them. Then the partition opened, and one of the paramedics came through and said, She's stable. Temp is coming up. We're going to transport to regional for observation, but it's precautionary at this point. And Sterling turned toward the voice, and the moment closed. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall and let his eyes close for 30 seconds. Just 30. He could hear the room around him, radio traffic bootsteps, a phone ringing somewhere, the particular bass frequency of large men moving with purpose. He cataloged it without opening his eyes. He was still doing it, still counting, still orienting. When he opened his eyes, Grizz Wolf was standing in front of him. Not looming, not performing, just standing the way a large man stood when he wasn't trying to be large, which somehow made him larger than when he was. He had a cup of coffee in each hand. He held one out. Caleb took it. Grizz sat in the chair Sterling had vacated, which was slightly too small for him, but which he occupied without appearing to notice. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the floor for a moment, the way men looked at floors when they were organizing something they didn't have a good language for. She told me everything, he said finally. In the last 20 minutes, while the paramedics were working. He paused. She told me about the breathing, about the chest episode at 11:43, about the protein bar. He looked up. She told me you lied about having another one. Caleb said nothing. She said she knew at the time, Grizz continued. She said she didn't call you on it because she understood why you did it. He studied Caleb with that total attention. She doesn't let things go unnoticed. Never has. Since she was 3 years old, she could tell when someone was managing her. I wasn't managing her, Caleb said. I was prioritizing. I know the difference, Grizz said. So does she. He took a drink of coffee, set the cup down on his knee. She also told me about the farm. Caleb felt his jaw set. That's not your business. I know, you said that on the mountain. Grizz held up one hand palm out, not aggressive, stopping the sentence before it built into something that would close the conversation down. I'm not trying to get into your business. I'm trying to have a conversation that I think we both need to have if you'll let me finish it. Caleb looked at him. Then he nodded. My daughter, Grizz said, has been at that school for 2 years. Do you know how many phone calls I've gotten from kids at that school? Their parents, anyone connected to that building. He waited. None, Caleb said. None, Grizz confirmed. Not one. I've sat at 100 club events and charity rides, and I've given more money to more causes than I'll ever count, and the world mostly takes it and looks the other way, because taking from me is more comfortable than acknowledging me. The flatness in his voice was not bitterness. It was something older than bitterness, something that had already passed through bitterness and come out the other side. Raven lives in a world where everybody takes something from her name and nobody gives anything back. Caleb thought about what she'd said in the cave, the relay station. The way she described it, the honest distance versus the fake proximity. You're the first person in 2 years, Grizz said, who went toward her when it would have been easier to stay still. Mr. Sterling should have. I'm not talking about Sterling. I'll deal with Sterling separately. A pause. The particular quality of that pause told Caleb that dealing with the Sterling was going to be thorough and not entirely comfortable for Sterling. I'm talking about you. You made a choice. You did it alone. You did it right. He picked up his coffee again. I don't take debts lightly. I don't carry them, and I don't leave them unpaid. If you let me, I'd like to address yours. Caleb was very still. What do you mean? The farm, Grizz said simply, the mortgage, the extension through March. He met Caleb's eyes. I have resources. I have people who handle transactions discreetly. I could make a call tomorrow morning and the debt would be gone by the end of business. The silence in Caleb's chest was so loud he almost couldn't hear the room. He looked at Grizz Wolf and he thought about a lot of things simultaneously. He thought about his mother's face when she read the bank letters, about his grandfather's hands, big and weathered, and certain the hands that had built the fence lines and laid the stone walls and planted the fields that were now in danger of belonging to someone else. He thought about what it meant to accept something from a man whose money came from a world Caleb didn't belong to and didn't fully understand. He thought about pride and whether pride was a thing you carried for yourself or a thing you carried for your family, and whether those were the same thing or completely different things. He thought about his grandfather. A checked fence is a safe fence. Prayers work better paired with inspection. He thought about what his grandfather would say about this particular fence. Why, Caleb said. Grizz looked at him. I told you, honor debt. An honor debt doesn't have to cost that much. You could buy me dinner. Something moved at the corner of Grizz's mouth. The beginning of something. I could, he agreed, but the farm debt is what I can do. And I'd rather do the thing that actually matters than the thing that's comfortable. Caleb held his gaze. You don't know me. I was in that situation for 6 hours. That doesn't... I know what you did in 6 hours, Grizz said. I've known men for 30 years. I've watched them in situations that stripped everything else away and showed what was actually there. 6 hours in a blizzard with my daughter's life on the line is not nothing. That's not 6 hours of doing somebody a favor. That's 6 hours of character under pressure, and I know what I'm looking at when I see it. Caleb looked at the coffee cup in his hands. The heat of it was working up through his palms, through the numbness, reaching the parts of him that had been cold for so long, he'd stopped registering the cold. He thought about March, about the bank, about his mother alone in the kitchen with that letter. I'd want it recorded as a loan, he said quietly. Grizz went still. I don't take gifts, Caleb continued. My grandfather didn't raise me to take gifts. If you want to help, I'll accept a loan at fair terms, recorded properly, and I'll pay it back. He looked up. That's the only way I can take it. Grizz studied him for what felt like a long time. Then he nodded once the settling kind. Fair terms, he said. I can do that. And I want to know what the terms are before I agree. Of course. And I want my mother involved in the decision. Absolutely. Caleb nodded. His jaw was still set, but something behind it had loosened by 1 degree. Not relief, not yet. Something more preliminary than relief, the feeling of a door having been found in a wall you'd thought was solid. Grizz looked at him for another moment. Then he said, She painted your road. Caleb looked at him sharply. Route 9, the stone walls. A quiet beat. She put it on my wall 6 weeks ago. I asked her what made her paint that particular spot, and she said she drove past it sometimes and it looked like somewhere that had decided what it was. He paused. I didn't know it was connected to anyone at her school. I didn't know it was connected to anything. It was just a road with stone walls. Another pause. Now I know what road it is. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure one was needed. Across the room, the partition opened again, and Raven came through it, moving under her own power now, a thermal blanket around her shoulders, color in her face that hadn't been there on the mountain. She scanned the room the way she always scanned rooms' exits. First, then people, then threats, and found Caleb and her father sitting side by side with coffee cups, and she stopped. What are you two talking about? She said. The farm, Grizz said, the painting, Caleb said. She looked between them. Her expression was complicated and unreadable for exactly 1 second. And then it wasn't, and what replaced it was something quiet and warm, and slightly disbelieving the look of someone who had arranged 2 separate parts of their life and was watching them find each other without having planned it. Okay, she said. Okay, she stopped. Tried again. That's a lot. Come sit down, Grizz said. She came and sat on the other side of her father, and for a moment the 3 of them sat there in a row. The biker, his daughter, the farm boy, and outside the storm ran its tail across the mountain, and the radio crackled, and someone made another pot of coffee, and the world continued with its noise. And inside that noise, the 3 of them were briefly simply quiet together. Then Mr. Sterling came back around the partition. He had Ms. Vance with them, and behind them, which Caleb had not expected, the resort's operations director, a man named Calloway, who had the look of someone who had spent the last 6 hours calculating liability and had not enjoyed the results. Sterling's tie was fully off now. He was holding a clipboard that Caleb recognized as the attendance sheet that should have existed before the bus departed. Sterling stopped when he saw Grizz. Grizz did not stand. He looked at Sterling with the particular calm that Caleb had already identified as the man's most dangerous setting. Not loud, not theatrical, just completely present. The way a mountain was present with the implicit understanding that the mountain's opinion of your plans was irrelevant to the mountain. Mr. Wolf, Sterling said. His voice was controlled. Barely. Mr. Sterling, Grizz said, I want to express on behalf of Hargrove Academy our profound relief that Raven is safe and our sincere. How many students were on that bus when it left the parking lot? Grizz said. Sterling stopped. Before you answer, understand that I already know. Grizz picked up his coffee cup. I know because Tank pulled the resort's departure log from their security system 40 minutes ago, and it shows the bus left at 14 minutes past the window with no recorded head count from the chaperone. Sterling's jaw moved. Nothing came out. There are two things I want you to understand. Grizz continued, same tone, same volume, same complete stillness. The first is that you will be answering to Hargrove's board about your conduct today, and I will be making sure that conversation happens in detail. I have a lawyer who specializes in institutional negligence, and he's already been briefed. He paused. The second thing I want you to understand is that the reason my daughter is alive is not your protocols, or your systems, or your coordination with Ski Patrol. The reason my daughter is alive is that boy. He tilted his head slightly toward Caleb. Who you told to sit down? The room was very quiet. Sterling looked at Caleb. The full, undefended look of a man confronting the version of a story that he'd already known was true and had been hoping wouldn't have to be said out loud in front of this many people. I know, Sterling said quietly. I know that. Good, Grizz said. Then we're starting from the same place. Calloway, the operations director, made a sound that was close to speaking and then thought better of it. Ms. Vance looked at her shoes. And Sterling stood with his clipboard and his loosened collar in the specific, quiet devastation of a man who had organized his entire professional identity around being the responsible adult in the room and had discovered in the worst possible way what that responsibility actually required. Caleb said nothing. He'd already said what needed saying on the bus 6 hours ago in front of 38 students who'd watched him step off into the storm. Whatever happened to Sterling now was between Sterling and the decisions he'd made. Caleb was not interested in the punishment. He was interested in what came after. What came after was a phone call. His phone had died on the mountain at some point between 11 and midnight. One of the chapter members had a charger that fit, and at 2:14 in the morning, Caleb sat in the corner of the ranger station and watched the screen come back to life and saw 14 missed calls from a number with a 603 area code that he would have recognized in his sleep. His mother. He called back without reading the text first. She picked up before the first ring finished. Caleb. Not a question, not a greeting, just his name and the voice of a woman who had been awake since the school's emergency notification had gone out at 3 in the afternoon and who had spent 11 hours with that particular quality of fear that parents carried and that children never fully understood until they were parents themselves. Mom, I'm okay. A sound on the other end of the line, brief and sharp, then her breath coming back under control. They said a student was missing. They wouldn't tell me which student. I'm okay. I'm at the ranger station at the base of the mountain. I'm warm. I'm not hurt. He paused. I found her mom, the missing student. She's okay too. A long pause. He could hear the kitchen behind her, the refrigerator hum, the particular creak of the floor near the stove that had been there since he was 4 years old and had never been fixed because there was always something more urgent than a creaking floor. You went out in the storm, she said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the statement of a woman who had raised this boy and was not surprised and was terrified by how unsurprised she was. Yeah. Caleb James Daniels. Mom, you are 20 years old, babe. I know. I know what the storm was. I was in it. He kept his voice gentle. I had everything Grandpa taught me. Everything. It worked. We're okay. Silence on the line. He could feel her processing this, the relief and the retroactive terror moving through her in the order they came. Relief first, because he was on the phone talking to her. Terror second, because now she was allowed to imagine what it would have been like if he hadn't been. Your grandfather, she said finally, her voice unsteady for the first time. He would have I know, Caleb said. I know he would have. They stayed on the line in silence for a moment together, in the way you could be together across 40 miles with a phone between you, sharing the presence of a man who wasn't there anymore and who somehow had been everywhere tonight. Mom, he said, there's something I need to talk to you about. Not tonight, you just need to sleep. But soon, maybe tomorrow. What is it? It's about the farm, about the mortgage. A pause. Well, I think there might be a way through. I need to talk to you about it properly with all the information, and you need to be the one who decides. But I wanted you to know that there might be something. A long silence. He heard her breathe. What kind of something? The kind I'll explain properly. Tomorrow, when we've both slept. He paused. Is that okay? Another silence. Then Caleb, what did you do tonight? He thought about the bus, about the counting, about the paperclip on his backpack, and the storm hitting the windows, and the 38 faces, and the one that wasn't there. About the trees and the footprints filling in the foil blanket, and the pine branches, and 6 hours in a cave with a girl who had painted his road from memory. I showed up, he said, like Grandpa told me to. His mother didn't answer for a moment. When she did, her voice was everything she wasn't saying. Come home tomorrow. Yes, ma'am. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hands and let the exhaustion hit him fully for the first time, the whole tidal weight of it. And it was enormous and complete. And he sat inside it and let it be what it was without fighting it, because there was nothing left to fight, not tonight, not now. Across the room, Tank was talking quietly to two other chapter members, heads together, the low, purposeful murmur of a debrief. The paramedics were packing equipment. Calloway had retreated to a corner with his phone, undoubtedly calling the resort's legal team. Sterling and Miss Vance had disappeared somewhere, which was probably for the best. Raven crossed the room and sat down next to him, not across and next to close enough that their shoulders were an inch apart, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just sat, and he felt the familiar warmth of her proximity, the way he'd felt it in the cave, the simple physical fact of another person being close. Your mom, she said. Yeah. Is she okay? She will be. She's been awake all night. Raven nodded. My dad called her, she said. Caleb turned his head. What? When we were coming off the mountain, he called her. He said, she paused, remembering the exact words. He said, Mrs. Daniels, my name is Marcus Wolfe, and your son saved my daughter's life tonight, and I wanted you to hear that from me directly. She watched his face. She cried. He told me afterward. He said she cried, and then she said, that's my boy. And he said that was the best sentence he'd heard all day. Caleb looked at the floor. His jaw was working on something he wasn't going to say out loud in a ranger station in the middle of the night, so he just let it work and kept looking at the floor until it settled. He likes you, Raven said quietly. My dad, he doesn't say it like that, but that's what it means when he calls somebody's mother. Caleb looked at her. She was watching him with that open expression she'd first shown on the mountain when she heard the radios, the unguarded one, the one underneath all the distance. I like him too, he said. That it surprises me. Why? Because I expected to be afraid of him, and I'm not. She almost smiled. You said that on the mountain about the storm versus my dad. I meant it on the mountain too. She was quiet for a moment, then, he's going to help with the farm. It's a loan, Sush. I know, he told me. She held his gaze. He respects that you said loan. He told me that too. A pause. He said that boy doesn't take things. He said it like it was the highest compliment. Caleb held on to that, filed it in the same place he filed the important things, the ones he'd need later. How are you, Hen? He said. Actually, cold, tired, better. She considered. Strange. Strange like something changed and I don't know what it is yet, but I know it changed. She looked at her hands and back at him. I've been at Hargrove for 2 years and I've been nowhere. And tonight I was somewhere, even if the somewhere was a hole in the snow on a mountain in a blizzard. She paused. Does that make sense? Yeah, he said. It makes complete sense. Outside, the storm had gone quiet. Not gone, so they were still working, but quiet in the way that told you the worst of it was over, and the rest was just endurance, the tail dragging through, losing interest, moving east toward the coast, where it would spend itself over the water and become nothing. Grizz appeared from across the room. He looked at them both, the evaluating look quick and total, and whatever he saw in the two of them sitting side by side with an inch between their shoulders appeared to satisfy some assessment he'd been running. "Transport's ready," he said. "Hospital for observation, then we bring you home." He looked at Caleb. "You'll ride with us." It was not a question. Caleb thought about the bus, about 38 seats and one empty one, and the moment he'd stood up. He thought about where that decision had carried him through 6 hours in a blizzard and a snow cave and a conversation with a man who called people's mothers to this ranger station at 2 a.m. with coffee in his hands, and the farm somehow still standing in the dark 40 miles away. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Grizz nodded, turned back toward the door. Then he stopped without turning around and said to the room in general, but to Caleb specifically, "The loan, we'll draw it up Monday, fair terms. Your mother present." A pause. "And Caleb," he said the name like he'd been saying it for years. "Thank you." It was simple and it was complete and it required nothing in response. So Caleb said nothing, and Grizz moved to the door, and the chapter fell in around him with the natural, unrehearsed coordination of people who had been moving together for a long time. And the ranger station began to empty, and the night that had started on a school bus with a paperclip and a broken zipper was moving towards something else now. Something that hadn't had a name this morning, but was beginning to find one. Raven stood. She looked at him. Ready. He picked up his backpack. The zipper still broken. The paperclip still doing its job. He looked at it for a second, that bent piece of metal, holding everything together by will and friction, and he thought about his grandfather and about what showed up in you when everything else was stripped away, and about stone walls on a county road that a girl had painted from memory and a man had put on his wall. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." The hospital released Raven at 7:43 in the morning. Not because they were finished being cautious. The attending physician had been very clear that he would have preferred another 12 hours of observation. But because Raven Wolf had made it equally clear at approximately 6:15 that she was leaving with or without a discharge form, and her father standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed had not contradicted her. The physician had looked at Grizz Wolf and made the particular calculation that emergency room doctors made when the patient was conscious, lucid, medically stable, and accompanied by someone who generated a specific quality of silence in a room, and he had signed the form. Caleb had spent the night in a waiting room chair, not because anyone had told him to stay, not because Grizz had asked him. He'd simply not left the way you didn't leave something that wasn't finished, and he'd sat in the orange plastic chair nearest the window and put his head back and let his body do its accounting. The knee, the hands, the cracked lips, the accumulated cold, while his mind stayed running, cataloging, processing the night, the way it always processed difficult things by turning them over slowly until they showed him something useful. He'd fallen asleep somewhere around 4 and woken at 6 to find a vending machine coffee on the floor next to his chair that hadn't been there before. He didn't know which chapter member had put it there. He drank it without investigating. When Raven came through the waiting room doors, she was dressed in a hoodie that was 3 sizes too large. Her father's from the look of it, and her hair was loose and her color was good. Genuinely good, the color of someone whose body had finished its argument with the night and declared itself operational. She moved with her usual careful, contained energy, and when she found Caleb in the orange chair, she crossed the room directly and sat down next to him. "You stayed," she said. "Yeah, you didn't have to." "I know." She looked at him for a moment with that reading expression. The math only had one answer again. He almost smiled. Something like that. Grizz came through the doors behind her tank at his shoulder. 2 other chapter members flanking, and the waiting room reorganized itself around them, the way spaces reorganized around Grizz Wolf. Not dramatically, not with obvious alarm, just a subtle reordering. People finding reasons to be slightly less in the way. He stopped when he saw Caleb, and something moved through his expression, quick and genuine, the version of relief that large men allowed themselves when no one was supposed to be watching. "You should have gone home," Grizz said. "I was going to," Caleb said. "Then I wasn't." Grizz looked at him for one beat. "Tank's driving you, non-negotiable." Caleb started to object and then thought about his knee and the 4-hour bus ride back to campus that was presumably happening sometime this morning and decided that non-negotiable was actually fine. "Okay," he said. "Not to campus," Grizz said. "Home, the farm." Caleb looked at him. Your mother's been awake all night, Grizz said. You told her you'd come home. Tank will take you. He paused. The school situation can wait one day. There was something in the way he said it, not commanding, not assuming authority he hadn't been given, but stating a thing that was clearly true and waiting for Caleb to confirm it, that reminded Caleb of his grandfather. The old man had done the same thing, presented reality as it was, and let you find your own way to agreeing with it. Yeah, Caleb said. Okay. He stood up. His knee told him immediately and clearly what it thought about that. He kept his face neutral. Raven noticed anyway. Of course she did. Your knee, she said. It's fine. It's not fine. You're compensating left. I'm walking. On a knee that took 2 impacts on the descent. She looked at her father. He needs it wrapped before he goes anywhere. Grizz looked at Tank. Tank produced a compression bandage from a vest pocket with the ease of a man who kept compression bandages in his vest pockets as a matter of routine, which apparently he did. Caleb sat back down and Raven, without asking, took the bandage from Tank and wrapped Caleb's knee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had grown up around men who regularly needed things wrapped and had learned by watching. She did it without comment. He let her. When she finished and he stowed again and his knee held the weight properly, she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was something in the exchange that didn't require words, something that had been building since the cave and that both of them recognized, and neither of them was going to name in a hospital waiting room with Griswold standing 4 feet away. Monday, she said. What? My dad mentioned Monday, the loan documents. She held his gaze. I'll be there. He blinked. You don't have to, what? I know I don't have to. She said it exactly the way he'd said I know the night before, in the same patient, slightly firm tone he'd used when she told him he didn't have to stay. I'll be there. He nodded. Okay. She stepped back. He picked up his backpack, the paperclip catching the morning light for just a second, and he followed Tank out through the hospital doors into a morning that had gone clean and cold and brilliantly blue, the sky after a mountain storm, doing what skies always did, making itself perfect, as if apologizing for the night before. The drive to the farm took an hour and 40 minutes. Tank drove the way he moved through everything efficiently, without wasted motion, comfortable in silence. He had the radio on low country station, and neither of them felt the need to talk over it. Caleb looked at the road and let his body slowly, degree by degree, return to normal. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, Tank said, Afghanistan, Kunar province, 2009. Caleb looked at him. I was in a snow shelter for 11 hours, Tank said, eyes on the road. 2 of us. We'd been cut off from the unit. The other guy built it. He knew how. A pause. I've been in a lot of situations. That's the one I think about most. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Did he make it, the other guy? Tank was quiet for just long enough that Caleb had the answer before he said it. No, Tank said. He didn't. The road ran through pine trees, then opened into a valley, then climbed again along the ridge that Caleb had driven 100 times in the dark of early morning on his way to school. He knew every curve of it. He knew where the ice formed first in November, and where the deer crossed in October, and where the stone walls ran parallel to the road on both sides for almost half a mile. The walls his grandfather had laid himself before Caleb was born, laid with the kind of care that meant they'd outlast everyone who remembered building them. He looked at those walls as Tank drove past, and thought about Raven painting them from memory, and about the painting on Griswold's wall in Manchester, and about the particular kind of seeing that made someone paint a road they'd only passed a few times, that made someone look at stone walls and see something that had decided what it was. She painted this road, Caleb said. Tank glanced at it, then back at the road. Yeah. 3 weeks ago, she said it looked like somewhere that had decided what it was and wasn't pretending. Tank was quiet for a moment. Smart kid, he said. Yeah, Caleb said. She is. His mother was on the porch when Tank pulled in, not waiting dramatically. She was holding a mug, and she was wrapped in the heavy wool blanket she kept on the porch chair in winter, and she had the look of someone who had been standing there not necessarily because they expected the car at that exact moment, but because being inside felt wrong, felt too far from the direction she was watching. She saw the truck and set the mug down on the railing with the particular deliberate care of a woman putting something down so her hands would be free, and she came down the porch steps as Caleb got out, and she crossed the frozen yard without her boots on, just wool socks, on the packed snow, And that detail hit him somewhere deep because his mother was practical. Above all things, practical and careful. And she had walked across frozen ground without boots because the 8 steps back inside to get them was 8 steps too many. She didn't say anything when she got to him. She put her arms around him and held on, and he put his arms around her and held back, and they stood in the yard in the cold morning with a man named Tank watching from a truck in the driveway, and Caleb felt the last of the night move through him and out the way the cold had moved through him in the cave, leaving the space where it had been cleaner than before. "You're okay," she said into his shoulder. "I'm okay, Mom. Your knee, it's wrapped." She pulled back and looked at him. The full inventory face hands posture, the knee, and whatever the inventory returned appeared to satisfy her, because she exhaled and became slightly less tense around the eyes, the tension going out of the place where she'd been carrying it all night. Then she looked past him at the truck, at Tank. Tank, who was 6'4" and built like a man who'd spent 30 years being prepared for something, who had a Hell's Angels patch on his vest, and the calm eyes of someone who had seen considerably more difficult things than a New Hampshire farmyard. "You're Tank," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Marcus Wolf called me last night." "I know, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment with the assessing look that Caleb had inherited from her, the same directness, the same refusal to accept the surface of a thing at face value. Then she said, "Come inside, I've got coffee and there's food." Tank got out of the truck. The kitchen was warm and it smelled like the kitchen always smelled: coffee and firewood, and the particular combination of flour and cold air that meant his mother had been baking since before dawn, which was what she did when she was worried it had always done it, the physical work of making something useful standing in for the helplessness of waiting. There were biscuits on the rack and eggs on the stove, and enough coffee for 6 people. Tank ate with the focused appreciation of a man who recognized real food and respected it. And Caleb's mother sat across the table and asked direct questions and listened to the direct answers, and the conversation that happened around that kitchen table in the first hour of the morning was the kind that settled things. She asked what had happened on the mountain, and Caleb told her plainly the way his grandfather would have wanted it, told no dramatics, no embellishment, just a sequence of decisions and the reasons behind each one. She asked about Raven. He told her about the cave, about the breathing exercises, about the chest episode at 11:43, about the protein bar. She asked about Grizz Wolf, and Caleb told her what Grizz had said in the ranger station, the loan the terms of Monday meeting. His mother was quiet for a long time after that. Tank refilled his coffee and did not appear to be in any particular hurry to be anywhere. "He wants to help with the farm," she said, not a question. "A loan, fair terms. He agreed to fair terms and to you being present for everything." Caleb held her gaze. "It's not charity. I was clear about that." "I know you were." She looked at her hands. "Caleb, we can't." "Mom." He said it gently, but with the particular firmness that he'd found in himself on the mountain, the thing that had shown up when the storm required it, which apparently didn't fully go back into storage when the storm ended. "We have until March. We've had until March for 3 months, and we've been running out of road. This is a door. I'm not saying we walk through it without looking. I'm saying we look." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with something more complicated, the recognition that her son had become somewhere between the farm and the scholarship and the mountain, someone who made decisions with the same quiet certainty his grandfather had made them. She could see it, and she was moved by it, and she was slightly undone by it, and she was going to process all of that later privately, the way she processed the large things. "Monday," she said. "Monday." She nodded once, the settling kind. Tank said from across the table, "For what it's worth, ma'am, Grizz Wolf is a man of his word. Whatever he agreed to will be what it is. He doesn't play games with agreements." She looked at Tank. "How long have you known him?" 22 years. "And in 22 years, not once," Tank said. "Not once. I am." She looked at Caleb again. Something passed between them, not words, not even quite a look, more like a current, the way things pass between people who had shared a house and a grief and a struggle and an inheritance. And then she stood up and began clearing plates, which was how she indicated that a decision had been made and the conversation about it was complete. The week that followed moved differently than weeks usually moved. There was the formal investigation conducted by Hargrove Academy's Board of Trustees, which took 4 days and resulted in Mr. Sterling being placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his conduct. The findings were not made public, but within the school's community, which was small and porous, and had the particular information economy of any place where privacy was theoretically valued and practically impossible. Everyone knew within 48 hours that Sterling had failed to conduct a head count, had ignored a student's warning, and had instructed that student to sit down while the student in question was already calculating how to go out alone into a mountain blizzard. Prescott Ashworth told someone who told someone who told 4 people, and what Prescott said was this: he was the only one who counted. The rest of us were on our phones, and he was counting students, and none of us thought to ask why. That one traveled fast. On Wednesday, Caleb walked into the dining hall at lunch and took his usual table in the corner and sat down with his tray, and 2 minutes later, a girl he'd spoken maybe 30 words to in 8 months sat down across from him. She was a junior named Sophia, and she looked nervous but resolved, and she said, "I heard what you did on the mountain. I wanted to say that was," she stopped, found the right word, "real." "Thank you," he said. She nodded, ate her lunch, left when she was done. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a turning point in any cinematic sense. It was just a girl who had something to say saying it, and a boy receiving it in the particular small weight of being seen and actually seen without the scholarship label or the farm or the broken zipper settling onto him like something he hadn't known was missing until it was there. On Thursday, he got a text from a number he didn't have saved. It read, "My dad put your road on a bigger wall. He had it framed. He says it deserved better than a push pin." "R," he read it 3 times. He saved the number. Monday arrived the way Mondays arrived, without ceremony, without particular acknowledgement of the fact that it was the day things were supposed to change. Caleb drove his mother's truck into Manchester and parked in front of a building that looked nothing like what he'd expected. Clean, professional, a law office that Grizz used for legitimate business. The kind of space that said serious transaction without saying anything about who was conducting it. Raven was already there when they arrived. She was sitting in the waiting area with a coffee and a folder of notes that she'd apparently prepared, which told Caleb everything about how seriously she'd taken the instruction to be present. She stood when she saw them, and she shook his mother's hand with both of hers, and his mother looked at her, and something moved across her expression, the recognition of one kind of strength by another. "You're Raven," his mother said. "Yes, ma'am." "Caleb's told me about the painting." Raven glanced at Caleb, and the edge of something appeared on her face, warm and private. "He's told me about the road," she said. His mother looked between them and appeared to draw several accurate conclusions that she had the good grace to keep to herself. Grizz arrived 8 minutes later with his lawyer, a man named Ferris, who was precise and organized and had clearly done this kind of work many times, and they sat around a conference table, and Ferris laid out the terms. The loan amount covered the full mortgage balance plus a 6-month operating buffer. The interest rate was prime minus 2 points, which Ferris explained was below market. The repayment schedule was 15 years with a grace period of 12 months. The collateral was the farm itself, but with a clause that Caleb read 3 times and then read again in the event of a payment default. After the grace period, the resolution process would go to mediation rather than foreclosure, and the mediator would be mutually agreed upon. Caleb's mother read every line. She asked 12 questions. Ferris answered each one completely. Grizz sat at the end of the table and said nothing, which was the right thing to do, which told Caleb that Grizz understood the difference between a negotiation and a conversation and knew which one this was. When his mother reached the last page and looked up, she looked at Grizz directly. "Why?" she said. "Just that." The same question Caleb had asked on the mountain. Grizz met her eyes. "Because your son kept mine alive," he said, then correcting himself without hesitation. "My daughter, because your son kept my daughter alive, and because what I can do, I do." He paused. "My father lost his business to a bank in 1987. Nobody helped. I've carried that for 37 years. He held her gaze. "I can put that weight down today. Today, if you'll let me." The room was quiet. Caleb's mother looked at the papers, then at Caleb, then at Raven, who was watching her with that total attention, then back at Grizz. She picked up the pen. She signed. What happened after the signing was not dramatic. Ferris collected the papers. Grizz shook Caleb's hand, and then, after a brief pause, shook his mother's hand, and she held it with both of hers for just a moment, the same way Raven had done when she arrived. And something passed in that grip that didn't need to be named. Raven leaned over and said something to Caleb's mother that Caleb couldn't hear. And his mother laughed, actually laughed, brief and genuine, the laugh that hadn't come easily since January, and said something back, and Raven's face did the warm, unguarded thing. Caleb watched all of it and stored it the way he stored the important things. 2 weeks after the mountain, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the kind of blue that existed only in February in New Hampshire, a Saturday when Caleb was in the barn doing the morning work, he heard engines. Not one, not two, more. The particular layered sound of multiple motorcycles coming up the county road at moderate speed, not aggressive, not performing, just the sound of a group of people moving with purpose toward a specific destination. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard and watched them pull in. 11 bikes, chapter members, most of whom he recognized from the mountain and the hospital and the Monday meeting. They came in and parked in a line along the fence with the practiced ease of people who had been parking together for years, and they got off their bikes and stood, and nobody said the first word for a moment, everyone waiting for Grizz, who came in last and parked at the end of the line and came off his bike and walked across the yard to where Caleb was standing. He looked at the barn, at the fence, at the stone walls, at the property line, the ones Caleb's grandfather had laid running straight and certain along the edge of the field. "I told the guys you had some fence work," Grizz said. Caleb stared at him. "I have some fence work," he confirmed. "North pasture section. Raven said you mentioned it." He hadn't mentioned it to Raven. He must have said something in passing in one of the conversations they'd been having since the mountain, the ones that started with a text and became something longer. Something he'd stopped trying to categorize. She must have filed it. "You came to fix fence," Caleb said. "We came to help with the farm," Grizz said. "Simple. Complete. Whatever needs doing today, that's what we're here for." Caleb looked at the line of men along his fence. Men with patches on their vests and winters on their faces, and the particular quality of stillness that came from people who had found their tribe and knew what it meant to work alongside them. He looked at Tank, who gave him a brief nod. He looked at the barn at the north field, at the fence posts that had needed resetting since October. He thought about his grandfather walking these same fields, about what the old man would say standing here looking at this particular assembly of people in his yard on a February morning. He thought the old man would say, "Well, look at that." His mother came out of the house onto the porch with a look on her face that moved through several stages. Surprise, assessment, something that was not quite disbelief, but was close to it, and then she went back inside. And 5 minutes later, she came back out and said to the General Assembly, "There's coffee and biscuits inside for anyone who wants them before you start. The north pasture fence is past the red barn, follow the tree line." The men moved, some toward the house, some toward the barn. Tank and 2 others headed for the tool shed without being directed, which told Caleb that Tank had been briefed on the layout, which meant Raven had provided a briefing, which meant she had been paying closer attention to what he said about the farm than he'd fully understood until this moment. He stood in the yard for a moment as it organized itself around him, this improbable Saturday morning, and then he heard a truck on the road and watched it pull in and watched Raven get out of the passenger side and stand there with her hands in her jacket pockets and her hair loose and her measuring expression, which softened by 1 degree when she saw his face. "You knew," he said. "My dad mentioned it. You briefed him on the farm layout. You mentioned the north pasture fence 4 times in 3 different conversations." She walked across the yard toward him. "I file things. I know you file things." She stopped a foot away. Close enough. The inch they'd been keeping between them since the hospital had been narrowing by degrees, the way temperatures change gradually, then suddenly, without a single dramatic moment that you could point to and name. "I wanted to see the road," she said, "in person, not from a car window." He looked at her for a moment. "Come on then," he said. They walked out through the gate and down the lane past where the men were already working the fence posts with the ease of people who understood physical work, past the red barn, and into the field where the stone walls ran along the property line, and they walked beside the walls in the February cold with their breath visible in the air between them. She stopped when they reached the corner where the walls met at a right angle. The oldest section laid before his grandfather's one, when she put her hand on the stone the way she must have touched paint, reading it, feeling the intention in it, the decision and the labor encoded in every placed rock. "This is it," she said, not asking. "This is it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then it's better in person." "Most things are." She looked at him sideways, and whatever she saw in his face prompted a decision that had apparently been accumulating for 2 weeks, and she stepped toward him and kissed him once, brief and deliberate, and completely like her. No preamble, no negotiation, just a direct movement toward a thing she'd decided on. He kissed her back. When she stepped away, she looked at him with that open expression, the one she'd first shown in the hospital waiting room, all the architecture down. And she said, "I've been wanting to do that since you handed me half a protein bar." He looked at her. "That was the most romantic sentence I've ever heard." She laughed. The full laugh, not the edge of one. It went out across the field and into the cold air and up into the blue of the February sky, and it was the best sound he'd heard since his grandfather had laughed the same way in this same field at something equally ridiculous. They walked back toward the farm, and the sound of men working the fence came to them across the field, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney rose straight up in the still air, and the stone walls ran beside them all the way home, certain and permanent in exactly what they were. That evening, when the work was done and the fence was reset and the men had eaten his mother's cooking until there was nothing left and the light was going gold and low across the north pasture, Griswolf stood at the fence line and looked at the field. Caleb stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. That was something Caleb had learned about Grizz over the past 2 weeks. The man was comfortable with silence, in a way that most people weren't the way people were comfortable with silence, when they'd spent enough years in loud situations to understand what quiet was worth. "My father's business was a hardware store," Grizz said, "in Concord. He ran it for 20 years. He looked at the field. "When the bank took it, he sat in the kitchen for 3 days and didn't speak. I was 19. I stood outside the kitchen door, and I couldn't go in." He paused. "I've spent a long time trying to be someone who could go in." Caleb looked at the fence line, at the posts his grandfather had set and the ones they'd reset today. "I think you found a way," he said. Grizz nodded, "the settling kind. Your grandfather built these walls. The far sections, the ones closest to the house, were here when he bought the property. He bought this farm. 1963, he was 24 years old." Caleb looked at the walls. He said he paid $400 and 3 months of labor on the previous owner's waste. He said it was the best transaction he ever made. Grizz was quiet for a moment. "It shows," he said. Raven appeared from the direction of the house, walking toward them across the field, and when she reached her father, she stood beside him and looked at the same thing they were looking at, the three of them in a row, at the fence line with the light going down. "What are we looking at?" she said. "The field," Grizz said. "The fence," Caleb said. She looked between them. "You two are very similar," she said. "It's a little unnerving." Grizz put his arm around her shoulders. She let him. Caleb looked at the walls, at the field his grandfather had worked for 40 years, that his mother had worked for 20, that he had worked since he was old enough to hold a tool correctly. He thought about March, which had been a deadline and was now just a month. He thought about the loan papers in Ferris's office, properly documented, fair terms, his mother's signature beside his. He thought about the mortgage that had been in her apron pocket and was not anymore. He thought about his grandfather's voice, which was still there in the place where it lived, and which had been there all the way through, on the bus, in the storm, in the cave on the mountain, in the ranger station, in the hospital, waiting room, in the kitchen, in the field, and everywhere in between. He'd spent 8 months at Hargrove Academy being invisible. He'd spent 20 years on this farm being formed by everything the invisible people had built and known and passed down without ceremony, without recognition, with only the work itself as its own evidence. The world had looked at Caleb Daniels and seen nothing worth seeing. The storm had looked at Caleb Daniels and found out it was wrong. The farm boy was never invisible. He was just waiting for the moment that required everything he already was, and the moment had come in the form of a blizzard in an empty seat on a school bus, and he had walked out into the white without hesitation because his grandfather had given him something no scholarship could buy, and no storm could take: the absolute knowledge of what to do when the math had only one answer. He was seen now. He was home. The walls were standing and the fence was reset and the field was exactly what it had always been. And Raven Wolf was standing 20 feet away, looking at the same stone walls she'd painted from memory, and the farm that his grandfather had bought for $400 and 3 months of labor was going to outlast the bank in the blizzard and everything else that had tried to take it. Some things you built to last. Some things lasted because of how they were built. And some things lasted because the people who cared about them refused with every decision and every counted breath and every step into the storm to let them go. That was the Daniels family. That had always been the Daniels family. And now, standing at the fence line with the light going down and the field holding the last of it, Caleb Daniels was no longer the boy the world overlooked. He was the man the storm had found out and the man he had always already been, and that was more than enough. That was everything.